Chapter 3. He was not entirely surprised to learn that no one in Dunwich could be found to undertake the demolition of the mill. Even such carpenters as those who had not worked for a long time were reluctant to undertake the task, pleading a variety of excuses, which Abner easily recognized as a disguise for the superstitious fear of the place under which one and all labored. He found it necessary to drive into Aylesbury, but, though he encountered no difficulty in engaging a trio of husky young men who had formed a partnership to tear down the mill, he was forced to wait upon their previous commitments, and had to return to Dunwich with the promise that they would come in a week or 10 days. Thereupon he set about at once to examine into all the effects of Luther Whateley, which still remained in the house. There were stacks of newspapers, chiefly the Arkham Advertiser and the Aylesbury Transcript, now yellowing with age and mouldering with dust, which he set aside for burning. There were books which he determined to go over individually, in order that he might not destroy anything of value. And there were letters, which he would have burned at once had he not happened to glance into one of them, and caught sight of the name Marsh, at which he read on. Luther, what happened to Cousin Obed is a singular thing. I do not know how to tell it to you. I do not know how to make it credible. I am not sure I have all the facts in this matter. I cannot believe but that it is a rigmarole deliberately invented to conceal something of a scandalous nature, for you know the Marshes have always been given to exaggeration, and had a pronounced flair for deception. Their ways are devious. They always have been. But the story, as I have it from Cousin Eliza, is that when he was a young man, Obed and some others from Innsmouth, sailing their trading ships into the Polynesian islands, encountered there a strange people who called themselves the Deep Ones, and who had the ability to live either in the water or on the earth. Amphibians they would then be. Does this sound credible to you? It does not to me. What is most astonishing is that Obed and some others married women of these people, and brought them home to live with them. Now that is the legend. Here are the facts. Ever since that time, the Marshes have prospered mightily in the trade. Mrs. Marsh is never seen abroad, save on such occasions as she goes to certain closed affairs of the order of Dagon Hall. Dagon is said to be a sea god. I know nothing of these pagan religions, and wish to know nothing. The Marsh children have a very strange look. I do not exaggerate, Luther, when I tell you that they have such wide mouths, and such chinless faces, and such large staring eyes, that I swear they sometimes look more like frogs than human beings. They are not, at least as far as I can see, gilled. The Deep Ones are said to be possessed of gills, and to belong to Dagon, or to some other deity of the sea, whose name I cannot even pronounce, far less set down. No matter. It is such a rigmarole as the Marshes might well invent to serve their purposes, but by God, Luther, judging by the way the ships Captain Marsh has in the East India trade keep afloat without a smitchin of damage done to them by storm or wear, the brigantine Columbia, the bark Sumatra Queen, the brig Hetty, and some others, it might also seem that he has made some sort of bargain with Neptune himself. Then there are all the doings off the coast where the Marshes live. Night swimming. They swim way out off Devil Reef, which, as you know, is 1.5 miles out from the harbor here at Innsmouth. People keep away from the Marshes, except the Martins, and some such others among them who are also in the East India trade. Now that Obed is gone, and I suppose Mrs. Marsh may be also, since she is no longer seen anywhere, the children and the grandchildren of old Captain Obed follow in his strange ways. The letter dwindled down to commonplaces about prices, ridiculously low figures seen from this vantage of over half a century later, for Luther Whateley must have been a young man, unmarried at the time this letter had been written to him by Uriah, a cousin of whom Abner had never heard. What it had to say of the Marshes was nothing, or all, perhaps, if Abner had had the key to the puzzle of which, he began to believe with mounting irritation, he held only certain disassociated parts. But if Luther Whateley had believed this rigmarole, would he, years later, have permitted his daughter to visit the Marsh cousins? Abner doubted it. He went through the other letters, bills, receipts, trivial accounts of journeys made to Boston, Newburyport, Kingsport, postcards, and came at last to another letter from Cousin Uriah, written, if a comparison of dates was sufficient evidence, immediately after the one Abner had just read. They were 10 days apart, and Luther would have had time to reply to that first. Abner opened it eagerly. The first page was an account of certain small family matters pertinent to the marriage of another cousin, evidently a sister of Uriah's. The second, a speculation about the future of the East India trade, with a paragraph about a new book by Whitman, evidently Walt. But the third was manifestly an answer to something Grandfather Whateley had evidently written concerning the Marsh branch of the family. Well, Luther, you may be right in this matter of race prejudice as responsible for the feeling against the Marshes. I know how people here feel about other races. It is unfortunate, perhaps, but such is their lack of education that they find much room for such prejudices. But I am not convinced that it is all due to race prejudice. I don't know what kind of race it is that would give the Marshes after Obed that strange look. The East India people, such as I have seen and recall from my early days in the trade, have features much like our own, and only a different color to the skin, copper, I would call it. Once I did see a native who had a similar appearance, but he was evidently not typical, for he was shunned by all the workers around the ships in the harbor where I saw him. I've forgotten now where it was, but I think Ponape. To give them their due, the Marshes keep pretty much to themselves, or to those families living here under the same cloud. And they more or less run the town. It may be significant, it may have been accident, that one select man who spoke out against them was found drowned soon after. I am the first to admit that coincidences more startling than this frequently occur, but you may be sure that people who disliked the Marshes made the most of this. But I know how your analytical mind is cold to such talk. I will spare you more of it. Thereafter not a word. Abner went through bundles of letters in vain. What Uriah wrote in subsequent letters dealt scrupulously with family matters of the utmost triviality. Luther Whateley had evidently made his displeasure with mere gossip clear. Even as a young man, Luther must have been strictly self-disciplined. Abner found but one further reference to any mystery at Innsmouth. That was a newspaper clipping dealing in very vague terms, suggesting that the reporter who sent in the story did not really know what had taken place with certain federal activity in and near Innsmouth in 1928, the attempted destruction of Devil Reef and the blowing up of large sections of the waterfront, together with wholesale arrests of Marshes and Martins and some others. But this event was decades removed from Uriah's early letters. Abner put the letters dealing with the Marshes into his pocket, and summarily burned the rest, taking the mass of material he had gone through out along the riverbank and setting fire to it. He stood guarding it, lest a chance wind carry a spark to surrounding grass, which was unseasonably dry. He welcomed the smell of the smoke, however, for a certain dead odor lingered along the riverbank, rising from the remains of fish upon which some animal had feasted. An otter, he thought. As he stood beside the fire, his eyes roved over the old Whateley building, and he saw, with a rueful reflection, that it was high time the mill were coming down, that several panes of the window he had broken in the room that had been Aunt Sarie's, together with a portion of the frame, had fallen out. Fragments of the window were scattered on the paddles of the mill wheel. By the time the fire was sufficiently low to permit his leaving it, the day was drawing to a close. He ate a meager supper, and, having had his fill of reading for the day, decided against attempting to turn up his grandfather's record, of which Uncle Zebulon Whateley had spoken, and went out to watch the dusk and the night from the veranda. hearing again the rising chorus of the frogs and whippoorwills. He retired early, wantonnedly weary. Sleep, however, would not come. For one thing, the summer night was warm. Hardly a breath of air stirred. For another, even above the ululation of the frogs and the demonic insistence of the whippoorwills, sounds from within the house invaded his consciousness, the creaks and groans of a many-timbered house settling in for the night, a peculiar scuffling or shuffling sound, half drag, half hop, which Abner laid to rats, which must abound in the mill section of the structure, and indeed the noises were muffled, and seemed to reach him as from some distance, and, at one time, the cracking of wood and the tinkle of glass, which, Abner guessed, very probably came from the window above the mill wheel. The house was virtually falling to pieces about him. It was as if he served as a catalytic agent to bring about the final dissolution of the old structure. This concept amused him, because it struck him that, willy-nilly, he was carrying out his grandfather's adjuration. And, so bemused, he fell asleep. He was awakened early in the morning by the ringing of the telephone, which he had had the foresight to have connected for the duration of his visit to Dunwich. He had already taken down the receiver from the ancient instrument attached to the wall before he realized that the call was on a party line and not intended for him. Nevertheless, the woman's voice that leapt out at him burst open his ear with such screaming insistence that he remained frozen to the telephone. "I tell ye, Miss Corey, I heard things last night. The ground was a-talkin' again. And along about midnight I heard that scream. I never figured a cow'd scream that way, just like a rabbit, only deeper. That was Ludy Sawyer's cow. They found her this morning, more'n half et by animals." "Miss Bishop, you don't suppose it's come back?" "I don't know. I hope to God it ain't. But it's the same as the last time." "Was it just the one cow took?" "Just the one. I ain't heard about no more, but that's how it begun the last time, Miss Corey." Quietly, Abner replaced the receiver. He smiled grimly at this evidence of the rampant superstitions of the Dunwich natives. He had never really known the depths of ignorance and superstition in which dwellers in such out-of-the-way places as Dunwich lived, and the manifestation of it was, he was convinced, but a mild sample. He had little time, however, to dwell upon the subject, for he had to go into the town for fresh milk, and he strode forth into the morning of sun and clouds with a certain feeling of relief at such brief escape from the house. Tobias Whateley was uncommonly sullen and silent at Abner's entrance. Abner sensed not only resentment, but a certain tangible fear. He was astonished. To all Abner's comments, Tobias replied in muttered monosyllables. Thinking to make conversation, he began to tell Tobias what he had overheard on the party line. "I know it," said Tobias, curtly, for the first time gazing at Abner's face with naked terror. Abner was stunned into silence. Terror vied with animosity in Tobias's eyes. His feelings were plain to Abner before he dropped his gaze and took the money Abner offered in payment. "You seen Zebulon?" he asked in a low voice. "He was at the house," said Abner. "You talked to him?" "We talked." It seemed as if Tobias expected that certain matters had passed between them, but there was that in his attitude that suggested he was puzzled by subsequent events, which seemed to indicate that Zebulon had not told him what Tobias had expected the old man to tell him, or else that Abner had disregarded some of his uncle's advice. Abner began to feel completely mystified. Added to the superstitious talk of the natives on the telephone, to the strange hints Uncle Zebulon had dropped, this attitude of his cousin Tobias filled him with utter perplexity. Tobias, no more than Zebulon, seemed inclined to come out frankly and put into words what lay behind his sullen features. Each acted as Abner, as a matter of course, should know. In his bafflement, he left the store, and walked back to the Whateley house, determined to hasten his tasks as much as he could, so that he might get away from this forgotten hamlet with its queer, superstition-ridden people, for all that many of them were his relatives. To that end, he returned to the task of sorting his grandfather's things as soon as he had his breakfast, of which he ate very little, for his disagreeable visit to the store had dulled the appetite which he had felt when he had set out for the store earlier. It was not until late afternoon that he found the record he sought, an old ledger in which Luther Whateley had made certain entries in his crabbed hand.